started a series called The Superheroes of Judges. These were men and women raised up by God to save the nation of Israel. And not only was Israel super struggling, but the superheroes that God raised up, these judges, they had struggles too. And the one we looked at last week was Ehud. And his perceived struggle was that he was different than society thought he should be, because he was left-handed. So his struggle was external. But this week's Bible character, their struggle was internal. And internal struggles are so difficult. So we are going to look at the character named Gideon. This is Gideon. Now, Gideon was raised up by God. My husband just came in the room. Gideon was raised up by God to save the nation of Israel, because at this point they had begun to do wicked things. And so God turned them over to be captive to the Midianites. So they were slaves for several years, and then they began to cry out to God. So God raised up a man named Gideon. But the struggle that Gideon faced was internal. So here's his brain, okay? And on the inside, he was insecure. The very first thing that Gideon says to God when God calls him as a superhero is, God, why did you choose me? I'm from the smallest tribe of Manasseh. We're weak and cowardly. Why did you choose me? But God still chose him. So he was insecure. Another internal struggle that he faced was that he was actually a coward. God's first instruction for Gideon was to go and tear down the altar of Baal. But he was a coward, so he did it at night. It says in the Bible, literally, he was scared of the men of the city. So instead of doing it at day, he did it at night. He was a coward. And the third internal struggle that Gideon faced was doubt. Doubt about who he was, doubt about who God was. And he had so much doubt that God had called him, and he was like, God, I just am not quite sure that you are who you say you are, and you'll do what you say you're going to do. So could you prove it to me? And so what Gideon did is he put out a piece of fabric, and he said, if this fabric in the morning is wet and all the ground around it is dry, then I'll know, God, you're real. And then it happened. The next day he woke up, and it was as he had said. But he was like, no, show me one more time, God. So he said, God, if you really want me to do this and you are who you say you are, will you make the fabric dry and the ground around it wet? And so he woke up the next day, and it was as he had said. So God proved himself to him, but he still had so many doubts. Okay, so internally he was struggling. Now, these struggles threatened to disqualify him, because what Gideon thought is that when God began to use him, that this would happen. He would just leak out, and it would not turn out well. Like it's not going to turn out well for my carpet right now. So he was worried that God wasn't going to be able to use him. I'll just put that over there for right now. Now, this reminds me of another superhero. If you've heard of him, a superhero named Spider-Man. Now, when Peter Parker became Spider-Man, he had a lot of internal struggles. He was selfish. He was prideful. He was vengeful. He struggled with his emotions not taking over. And the consequence of all that internal struggle was actually that his it cost his uncle his life. His uncle died because of his internal struggles. But even with all that, he was still able to save the city of New York. And it's the same for Gideon, that even with all of Gideon's internal struggles, God still saved the nation of Israel through him. And he ended up going to war against 135,000 men in the Midianite army with only 300 men of his own. And God still saved the nation through him. So here's the thing. God, when we say yes to him, despite our internal struggles, what God does is here's God, he comes and covers us so that when God pours his power into us, it stays in. He covers our internal struggles. And the only thing that we need to do is we need to say yes to God, to covering us. Woo! So, here's the thing. God does not need you to have it all together. You're going to have internal struggles, and that's just a fact of life. But he needs you to say yes to him, just like Gideon ultimately did. Even though he had so much going on in his mind, he still said yes. And God invites you to say yes to him and see what he's going to do through you. So, that's the end of today's lesson. I hope that you are doing well, and I will see you later.